Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest, a podcast on Reformation history and theology. And just a reminder for listeners, if you haven't done so, please feel free to give us a rating, whether on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or however you listen to us, whatever platform you listen to us. If it lets you do a rating or give feedback or anything, we appreciate getting that. So this is Drew speaking. I'm joined with our co-host James, who's with us, and we have a special guest today, the Most Reverend Peter D. Robinson, who's actually the presiding bishop of the United Episcopal Church of North America. And he originally hails from England, where he was baptized in the Church of England, and he holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Leeds, and he is just kind of some fun info on him. He's a bagpipe player, a church history enthusiast, and a frequent contributor to the North American Anglican, and of which is the topic today. We're going to talk about an article that he wrote. But Bishop Peter, welcome to the show.
Good evening.
And have you been on a podcast before?
No.
Oh, okay. So this is your first.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's awesome for us. I'm delighted that we are your first podcast. And so like I said to our listeners, he's written quite a bit, and but we're going to focus today on something he's written recently for North American Anglican, which is an article he wrote called Melanchthon and Anglicanism. And just to kind of preface this, I recently read a biography of Melanchthon. For our listeners, I want to let Bishop Peter give more of the intro of Philip Melanchthon. But just to say, Philip Melanchthon was a reformer of the 16th century and a close associate of Luther. I recently read a bio of him called A Life of Philip Melanchthon by Carl Friedrich Ledderhose. Ledderhose. I think I'm pronouncing. I think it's like Lederhosen, like the pants. Like, when you go to a Bavarian fest and people are wearing the overall looking pants. That's literally the last name. And I'll have to admit, reading that bio filled in a lot of gaps for me because, as listeners will know on this podcast, we've spoken an awful lot about Luther, and Melanchthon's come up too, but we talk about kind of the origins a lot. And then we kind of look at history broadly, and then we look at recent history. But that kind of mid to late, kind of the middle. If you were to divide the 16th century up into thirds, kind of that second and third, I guess, of that century, a lot goes on. And looking at the story of Melanchthon, really bridges the gap of between Luther and Lutheranism is all I'll say. That's really what I took away from reading this biography. I had no idea how involved he was. Well, I knew he was involved and went to councils and diets and talked with theologians and tried to forge political alliances too, but I just didn't. I had no idea of the extent of it. And so Melanchthon is a very interesting person with a very interesting life. But I guess Bishop Peter, just to start us off, since you wrote this article about him, and the title is called Melanchthon and Anglicanism, we can get into that connection a little bit. But just kind of looking at Melanchthon right now, what kind of give us kind of an introduction of who he is, but also an introduction to who he is and why it's important to know about him.
I think the first thing to remember about Philip Melanchthon is that he is one of the leading Christian humanists of the 16th century. His great uncle was Reuchlin, the Hebrew scholar. He's educated at Heidelberg and Tübingen. He accepts the chair at Wittenberg, and at that time he's already written 6 works, including an introduction to the Greek language. He has been highly praised by Erasmus, and his works are already, as early as 1518, beginning to be read in humanist circles in England. And this is a man who is barely 21 years old when he goes to Wittenberg. He rapidly becomes close friends with Martin Luther. They are close friends, but they do not necessarily think alike. This is partly because Luther is very much a product of the old Augustinian tradition of theology. He's pretty much in the scholastic tradition. His education, even though he's only 14 years older than Melanchthon, is still very much the old learning through the University of Erfurt. Melanchthon, on the other hand, has very much embraced the new learning, Christian humanism, and he uses his tools as a Greek scholar and as, to a certain extent, a historian as well as a theologian, to flesh out, in certain cases, Luther's ideas. I almost have this picture in my mind. There are 3 key people in Wittenberg in the 1520s, and that's Luther, who's having the ideas, Melanchthon, who is whipping them into coherent shape, and then there's Johannes Bugenhagen, who gives it administrative shape. Luther's relationship with England was always problematic. He and Henry VIII put 2 stones to fighting. They did not like each other. Every contact they had with each other, for instance, when Henry VIII wrote the Defensio Septem Sacramentum, or maybe got Thomas More to do it, we're not quite sure, Luther's reply is absolutely blistering. I mean, it's rude even by Luther's standards.
That's pretty rude then, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you know, the scatological language is flying left, right, and center on that one.
He calls him a baboon too, I'm pretty sure.
Oh yeah, he was chucking the good old Lutheran insult generator that day.
And to give context for the listeners, this is Luther weighing in on Henry's the king's personal matter, as it's called,
not yet.
Okay.
The Septem Sacramentum is Henry VIII's attack on Luther's sacramental theology, which is about 1525. It's before Henry VIII's succession problems began to bite. So those 2 already did not like each other. Melanchthon, by the mid-1520s, is really he's the intellectual organizer. He's written the Loci Communes, which is the first Protestant systematic. He's already married. He's very quick to get married, because Melanchthon was always a layman, which often gets forgotten. He was professor of Greek at Wittenberg. He did not take orders, although he all held the degrees of Master of Arts, Bachelor of Divinity, and later Doctor of Divinity. He was not himself a cleric. He was married to the mayor's daughter, Katharina Krapp, one of the easier names to remember in Reformation history.
Yeah.
And
it's crap with 2 P's at the end, though. So.
And okay.
I think.
And the long and the short of the matter was he was sort of integrated into the guild, city council, university elite at Wittenberg much earlier than Luther was. Luther was kind of the star turn at the university, but Melanchthon basically had ties to the city much more quickly than Luther did, because Luther's in the process of divesting himself of his identity as an Augustinian monk.
Mm.
And that process really isn't completed until he finally gets married. Finally throws off monkery altogether. Melanchthon is responsible for many of the major documents of the German Reformation. So the instructions to visitors of 1528, the Augsburg Confession of 1530, the apology for the Augsburg Confession in 1531. He works with Butzer on the Wittenberg Concord in 1536. He publishes the Augsburg Variata in 1540. In 1543, he again works with Butzer on producing the pious consultation of Hermann von Wied, which was the proposed reform of the Diocese of Cologne, which proved so influential in the drawing up of the first prayer book. So he's always up to something. He's always doing something. He's a major figure in German university reform during the earlier part of the 16th century. He has a hand, for example, in the foundation of the University of Königsberg, also Jena. So, as well as reforms in Heidelberg, Wittenberg, Tübingen, he's all over the place educationally as well. He's a founder of what we think of today as classical education.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Melanchthon the theologian, you have Melanchthon the Greek scholar, you have Melanchthon the university reformer, you have Melanchthon the negotiator, because he's there at Marburg, he's there at Wittenberg when the English turn up, he's there at Wittenberg when the Reformed turn up, he's there at Leipzig, he's there at Augsburg. He's always there. Because unlike Luther, he was never under the ban of the empire.
Right. He's able to travel. And he did a lot of traveling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, you mentioned his educational background, but what I found interesting from the bio that I read of him is that Melanchthon was always offered these teaching, I guess, professorial posts at all these big schools in Germany. I mean, schools that are still, the legacy schools of Germany. And he always turned them down. He stayed in Wittenberg for, his whole life, which was interesting to me. Like there was something about that place that drew him there,
Wittenberg gave him a chance when he was still under age for a lot of university chairs in Germany. Wittenberg was a new university, relatively speaking, only been founded about 1502. He's the first professor of Greek at Wittenberg. And I think because the elector had given him the opportunity when he was still a very young man to take the chair at Wittenberg, he always had a definite loyalty to Wittenberg and to the university there. And of course, he is very much rooted into the city through his marriage to Katharina. And through the connections he made in the university, it would not have been an easy uprooting for Melanchthon. Particularly as he had done so much alongside Luther to shape the university in Wittenberg.
Right.
The other thing was, to a certain extent, Melanchthon didn't need to go to the world because the world was coming to Wittenberg. I mean, if you look around Northern Europe, you've got Robert Barnes from England, you've got William Tyndall from England. There's a steady stream of English students who fetch up in Wittenberg. Hans Tausen, who is the major reformer in Denmark, he studied at Wittenberg. The Petri brothers in Sweden, they studied at Wittenberg. So all these people are passing through Wittenberg and being educated by Luther, Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, the whole group. Then, of course, you have the influence of Melanchthon's books. You see, Heinrich Bullinger, when he was teaching theology at Kappel, his theological text was the Loci. When Melanchthon revises the Loci in 1535, he dedicates it to Henry VIII.
Yeah.
By the mid-1530s, it's on the curriculum at Cambridge.
Wow.
Elizabeth I had large chunks of the Loci memorized. So then when you look, for instance, at the German Reformed tradition, Zacharias Ursinus was basically Melanchthon's, he boarded with Melanchthon for 7 years. Before going back to Breslau and being kicked out for being too Philippist on the sacrament.
Yeah.
Which caused him to go to Zurich, where he meets Bullinger and Vermigli. Vermigli, of course, was by that time the former professor of divinity at Oxford. And then, of course, he goes to Heidelberg, and at the recommendation of Vermigli, writes the Heidelberg Catechism, and is, the major figure behind the German Reformed Church. But first and foremost, he was always a pupil of Melanchthon.
So I remember you mentioned in one of the sources of the article you wrote, I don't remember the particular one. I could actually look at it because I have it in front of me. You mentioned how the German Reformed tradition, well, it was Heinrich Heppe, who was a great, I would say, curator, compiler of the kind of the Reformed scholastic tradition. I did a course on Protestant scholasticism years ago, and he did, there's a work called Reformed Dogmatics by him, which is basically a compendium of those works. And Heppe was, you said, maintained that the origins of the German Reformed tradition was actually more from Philippism or this, school of Philip Melanchthon, rather than as an import from the Swiss Confederation, which I found interesting. I don't know much about the German Reformed tradition. I know, of course, the story of Luther in Germany, and then, later modern theology out of Germany. But so I thought that was I found that very interesting that Heppe, that's his position.
Yeah. What you're dealing with in the 1550s and the 1560s is, as you mentioned earlier, the move from Luther to Lutheranism. This is when it takes place. And what you have is, to simplify it, you've got the Philippists and you've got the Flacians.
Right. Well, and I've also heard it called the Nasio-Lutherans versus the Philippists.
Yeah, I have trouble getting Nasio out. So, the Flacians and the Philippists. The Philippists are kind of, I hate using the word liberal because the word liberal has become devoid of nearly all meaning in the modern world. But if you like, they're the loose Lutherans. They're the humanistic Lutherans. The Flacians are more neo-scholastic and tend, if anything, to be rather aware of Catholic criticism on points like the doctrine of the Eucharist and predestination, but they are more radical in their treatment of justification by faith. And the two of them are really fighting for supremacy within German Lutheranism from 1552 through to 1577. I mean, the Book of Concord is really what finally locks down orthodoxy in Germany as being the Flacian interpretation, not the Philippist. But you have a string of states in southwestern Germany which are leaning towards Philippism because Philip Melanchthon was from the Palatinate. So you have the Palatinate itself, Nassau, Hesse, they tend to listen a lot to Philip because, you know, they can understand him before breakfast in the morning. He speaks their dialect. And, you know, he's one of them. Heidelberg, Tübingen, he's one of them. Funnily enough, those churches are also tend to be influenced by Martin Bucer, who is from Schlettstadt in Alsace, which is just over the Rhine. He, again, has connections with the University of Heidelberg. So Philip Melanchthon and Martin Bucer they like each other and they tend to work together.
Yeah.
Now, this becomes important in the Anglican context because Bucer, having been pushed out of Strasbourg with the interim in 1547, is looking around for a job, and Cranmer invites him to Cambridge. And Bucer's position is, like Melanchthon, really rather in the middle of what was later to become Lutheranism and Calvinism.
Yeah, especially on the Lord's Supper.
Yes.
That was kind of, it seems to me that was when I was going back to the Melanchthon bio I read, and then after I was reading that, I was also reading J.A.O. Preus, you know, one of the Missouri Synod big leaders, wrote a book on Martin Chemnitz, but he spends the first 25% of that book just being very critical of Philip Melanchthon. And for me, it was you know, the chief article of faith that a lot of these are more hardline parties of, like you said, the Flacians, the people who, you know, third generation Lutherans who felt that they were, you know, carrying on the real convictions and theology of Luther. That was the main bone they had to pick with Melanchthon, because he did, I think, because of all his genuine, I believe, concern with trying to get all the reformational churches on the same page and in concord, you know, did see or saw, you know, in the Eucharistic theology of Calvin, you know, something that wasn't, you know, he didn't see it as something to, he didn't see it in a negative light as some of the other Lutherans did. So I just thought that was, you know, really interesting how that, particularly on the Lord's Supper, where that was a big, you know.
The timeline is an interesting one here because Melanchthon moves away from the realism of Luther early in the 1530s, before Calvin is even a player.
Right, because it was kind of late 1530s when Calvin kind of comes along with.
Right.
Yeah.
And Calvin's Eucharistic theology is Bucer's.
Yeah.
I mean, Calvin doesn't sort his Eucharistic theology out until he's in exile in Strasbourg in 1539, 40 something, 44, I think it is. And really the sort of real spiritual presence, understanding of the Eucharist, it really is Bucer and Melanchthon trying to find the middle ground between Luther and the Swiss. Bucer will often go a little too far in compromising with the Lutherans, you know, hence the difficulty in getting the Wittenberg Concord to stick with the Swiss. But on the other hand, it is his theology which, through Calvin, becomes normative for Calvinism down to the late 18th century. And then, of course, you have the influence in America of what they think is Scottish common sense realism on, for example, Hodge. And Hodge's view of the Eucharist is much closer to Zwingli than it is to Calvin, which is why Nevin went after him in the Mystical Presence, trying to restore the Calvin Butzer understanding of the Reformed doctrine of the Eucharist. Now, what you get in Melanchthon is a less well-developed real spiritual presence understanding of the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain things that Melanchthon really does go out of his way not to say. You know, he doesn't say anything one way or the other about whether the presence is localized in the bread and the wine. He just simply affirms the reality of a Eucharistic presence. And this comes out in the linguistic tweaks that he makes to the Variata in the late 1530s. And of course, Calvin later signs the Variata. So, you know, you've got this, if you like, there's a continuum in the middle.
Right.
And you've got Melanchthon on the Lutheran side of the middle. Butzer is really the middle of the middle. And then Calvin is on the Reformed side of the middle. And then you have a few, you know, more austere spirits on either side. For instance, people like Jan Lasky or Zwingli. Zwingli actually by this point has been safely dead for 10 years, but you know, the people who directly follow Zwingli are sort of more extreme than Calvin in terms of the way in which they treat the church, the sacraments, the liturgy.
John Knox would be an example.
Yeah, Knox would definitely be an example of that. Then, on the other hand, you've got the Lutherans who are more moderate, but the Lutherans, in many ways, are often quite pragmatic. The early stage of the Reformation in Denmark, the actual thinking is basically Melanchthon's, but the church order is Budenhagen's, and therefore very, very, very traditional. You know, Eucharistic vestments, the Mass is partly in Latin. They maintain the old hierarchy, although they lose the apostolic succession. Sweden, the Petri brothers both have a tendency towards Melanchthon. And there's certain characteristic Melanchthon ideas, like his emphasis on matters adiaphora, which come through in the Scandinavian churches, they come through in the Church of England. And they are, in many ways, what ends up making actually the Swedish Reformation and the English Reformation a little bit different. And another thing that happens with Melanchthon is that although his influence in England fades in the 1560s, when Calvinism in its developed form asserts itself in the 1580s and the 1590s, people like Peter Barrow appeal to Melanchthon against Calvin. They appeal to Melanchthon's more humanistic, pastoral understanding of predestination against the developed Calvinism of Beza. And this becomes a pattern that carries through into the 17th century, although you know, they maybe don't follow Melanchthon in any great detail, but a lot of the early high churchmen, people like Peter Barrow, Peter Heylin, Herbert Thorndike, George Bull after the Restoration, all appeal to Melanchthon as being the exemplar of a moderate, humanistic, patristic, Protestant tradition, which they are trying to steer the Church of England into,
Right.
as an alternative to rigid Anglo-Saxon Calvinism.
So that brings us up to really what you wrote in your article about. In your article, you did cite, and I went and read not the whole entirety, but a large chunk of it. You start off your article with referencing another article called "The Anglican Appeal to Lutheran Sources." Philip Melanchthon's reputation in 17th century England by Dewey D. Wallace Jr. And I went and read that article too, along with yours. And Dewey points out that in the 1590s, the Church of England is starting to experience, of course, the more radical puritanical groups that want to break away, but then you have the people that are called the conformists, which want to stay with the established church. And some of these conformist writers, Dewey writes how they appeal to Lutheran sources, and I found it interesting because, as Dewey says, they wanted to distinguish themselves more markedly, he says, from Calvinist Puritan opponents. So
Mhm.
so I take this as, because this also made me think of Richard Hooker, and
Mhm.
He's dead by 1600, but the decades leading up to this, he's kind of roughly the same time. He's also a witness to this emerging tension within the English church, and so the people who we would call conformists who want to stay with the established church, they are reformed. But even though they are reformed, there are things in the church they consider to be of very secondary importance, like, surrounding how worship is done, what vestments can be worn. But they're willing, and because of that, they're willing to retain traditional forms of this because they see them as secondary and not essential, like to one's salvation. And so, scripture doesn't prescribe or forbid them one way or another. But then there's the nonconformists who are, more radical. They adopt more of the regulative principle from the continental reform tradition, which is much more black and white about things. The conformists would say that thing that are there are things that they would fret over that the conformists wouldn't. But not to quibble with Dewey, but on that point. But I think it's fair to say though that Calvinism, I don't find the term Calvinism as what distinguishes this one group from the other. I think the conformists and the nonconformists are both Calvinist, in
Yeah.
a certain sense. I think Melanchthon is, let me know if I'm kind of accurate in reading this. I think Melanchthon represented for the conformists, or the conformists they found in Melanchthon, a good representative for the adiaphora argument.
Mhm.
Melanchthon was involved with so many dialogues with fellow Protestants in Rome, but like when he was talking with Rome, when it came to, like, for instance, when it came to questions of ceremony, Melanchthon was really willing to retain a lot of that because he said, these are secondary things. They're not of essence to one's salvation, and so I don't know how I guess, yeah, what do you say to that? Because I think it's safe to say both parties were Calvinists.
If you look at the history of the English Reformation, the Wittenberg Articles of 1536, the 10 Articles of 1536, the 13 Articles of 1539. It comes back round again in the English version of the 13 Articles in 1563, and both the Latin and the English versions in 1571. they all make room for this concept of adiaphora. And in the first 3 documents, the Wittenberg articles, the 10 articles, and the 13 articles, Melanchthon's hovering in the background, even though he's not there in the case of the 10 and the 13. So the concept of adiaphora was very important in the early stages of the English Reformation, because the early stages of the English Reformation were a balancing act between Henry VIII, who is even more of a politique in religion than his daughter, who really, in his heart of heart, he likes the traditional theatre of the Sarum Rite. Theologically, I think he's a Catholic humanist, but like a lot of Catholic humanists, even like his opponent Reginald Pole, he's a bit, fuzzy around the edges. He can go for justification by faith, provided he can still creep to the cross on Good Friday. You've got that weird sort of attitude to religion with Henry VIII. That feeds through in some strange way becomes part of the mainstream theological tradition amongst English Protestants. So they treat liturgy and ceremonial from almost a practical point of view rather than an ideological point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And they are backed in this, for example, by Butzer and by Bullinger, much to the frustration of some of the proto-Puritans like Samson. So there's always this tension between, on the one hand, what I would describe as, well, really, we're back to the Knoxians and the Coxians. You've got Cox, who regards the English Reformation's habits as normative for the English Church. You've got Knox, who is always pushing for further reform. And although both sides are very concerned with what constitutes pure worship, there's almost a sense in which the English Church, its formularies, tend to work on the principle that which is not forbidden or unhelpful is permitted, whilst those on the more radical side want specific scriptural warrant. And the tension actually is somewhat similar to that that leads to the Second Reformation on the continent. So, for example, when Brandenburg's royal house goes reformed in 1613, a lot of the ceremonies that they purge out of the court chapel, because they don't insist that Brandenburg convert to the Reformed religion. What's purged out of court circles are things like Eucharistic vestments, surplices, leavened bread, altars, the more complicated form of service that was associated with Lutheranism. And you can almost see the demands of the Puritans as being a demand for an English Second Reformation. But it doesn't get very far, because you're up against, first of all, there is a court party within the church, the conformists. And then you've got the situation under Elizabeth I, where Elizabeth was pushed too far on religion at the beginning of her reign. And I'm not saying, by the way, when I say that, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that she was anything other than a definite Protestant. But she was pushed really hard at the beginning of her reign to go further in the direction of Zurich and Geneva than she wanted to go. So for the remaining 44 years of her reign, she's going to camp out on 1599, 1559 settlement and not move. And then when James I comes along in 1603, he had such a belly full of the Scottish Kirk that he was quite happy not to be in England and not be lectured by the preachers. And so he makes some minor reforms to the Church of England. You know, the 1604 canons appear, the King James Version of the Bible appears, the Catechism is updated. There are minor reforms, but he's very happy with the state of religion in England. But what you have in this period is you have a court Anglicanism, which in modern terminology we would describe as high church. And you have a country Anglicanism, which is very much in the Reformed mold.
Hmm. This yeah, this brings me to my when I read your article, well, and also when I read Dewey's article, both they offered a narrative of 16th, 17th century Anglicanism, you know, a narrative of classical Anglicanism that I'm not used to hearing. There's, of course, there's the very common, I think, unfortunately, revisionist narrative of 16th, 17th century Anglicanism that you get from a lot of Anglo-Catholics and modern Anglicanism. That, you know, Anglicanism is the via media between Rome and Protestantism, or that, or you know, that Anglicanism is one of three branches, along with Rome in the East being the other two of what true apostolic Christianity is. I was listening to a Facebook argument on that. I don't want to think about that. but then you get to sort of also what I would call the Reformation Anglicanism narrative, which James and I often espouse on this podcast, I should say, you know, which is basically that, you know, Cranmer was influenced by the Continental Reformation. The 39 articles clearly show the direct influence of the Continental Reformation. People like Zach Hicks, who we've had on the podcast, demonstrate how the liturgical language of Cranmer's compositions and revisions of the Parochial were influenced by the Continental Reformation, all that. And, you know, and then if we're going to use the term via media at all, that it's a via media between Wittenberg and Geneva, or perhaps Wittenberg and Zurich, but not one.
I would tend to go for Wittenberg and Zurich.
Yeah. But that tends to be our narrative, but the one you present, I think, is another narrative that you and Dewey you touch on, is that, you know, it's maybe more complex than the narrative we just, you know, because for one, you know, I think you and Dewey both, you know, call out the revisionist narrative, obviously. You know, the 16th century appeal to Lutheranism, I remember saying, you know, the 16th century Anglican appeal to Lutheranism by these conformist Anglicans, they weren't, you know, that was later obscured by the revisionist narrative to say, you know, this was a Catholic revival, quote unquote, but it was more, you know, and then supposedly that's what the Caroline Divines are about and all that, you know, that, but really they were, Dewey even says that the Divines had essentially a Protestant cast of mind.
Oh, yeah.
So this whole like high church Protestant Anglicanism looking to Melanchthon, more radicals looking to Calvin, but even maybe beyond Calvin,
More
obviously. It's just a
Based
new narrative that I'm not used to, you know.
Yeah, what you've actually got in England is really, you've got a two-stage Reformation. The sort of preamble to the Reformation, which is all before 1547, is very, 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 very heavily influenced by Melanchthon, because he is acceptable with Henry VIII in a way that Luther and many of the other reformers were not. After 1547, with the defeat of the Protestant powers in the Schmalkaldic War, on the one hand, you get a flow of reformed theologians into England. So you get Vermigli, Butzer, Aquino, Lasky, they're all in London about the same time. And that, it makes the English Reformation more radical, but it doesn't actually work against the sort of evangelical humanism that's already there through the influence of Melanchthon. Because as you go into the next generation of reformers, they're influenced by Butzer at Cambridge, and then later on they're influenced, say, by Bullinger in Zurich, or Calvin in Geneva, but they're still basically in the same interconnected group of reformers. So Melanchthon was close to Butzer. Butzer basically was grad school for Calvin. Bullinger was teaching from Melanchthon's text in the 1520s. They all knew each other's ideas. And it's only as you go into the 1560s and the 1570s that they begin to pull into different schools.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bit of deliberate positioning on the part of the Elizabethan settlement to try and sit between the Lutherans and the Reformed, whatever they are, as the situation develops. So there's a fun, in a funny sort of a way, you could almost say the English settlement ends up being a Reformed set of articles with a low Lutheran liturgy. But then when you start picking the prayer book apart, it's a Lutheran liturgy that's either Reformed around it. You know, there's this sort of more conservative element that endures through the Reformation, because the English are terrible for recycling stuff. We never throw a good idea away unless we have to. And this sort of institutional conservatism is very much part of how the English Reformation is done. And so what I tend to see the arguments of the latter part of the reign of Elizabeth, James I, Charles I, it's an argument within the English Reformed tradition between those who are influenced by the older sort of Christian humanism represented by Melanchthon, and those who are influenced by the emerging Reformed scholasticism represented, for example, by Beza. But then, oh dear, I wish I could remember the fellow's name. Milton, the current professor of modern history at Sheffield, he's been looking at what is read and published in England in the late 16th century. And one of the things he found was that Aquinas' commentary on the Heidelberg Confession sells far more copies than Calvin's Institutes. And of course, when you've got Aquinas in the mix, you've got a direct pupil of Melanchthon. Another popular work in the later Elizabethan period is Bullinger's Decades. And of course, Bullinger, there are points in Bullinger where he agrees with Melanchthon. For instance, his less radical stance on predestination, although eventually he does make peace with Calvin. I'm not sure he would have made peace with Beza on that point, but he certainly makes peace with Calvin on that point. You know, he states predestination in positive pastoral terms.
Mm-hmm.
So that it's a very confused and confusing situation, which is made even more confusing by people like Thomas Bilson, who gets into an argument about the dissensus clause in the Apostles' Creed and immediately starts picking up on Lutheran arguments about the dissensus to defend his position against the Puritans. Then, of course, there is an argument in which you could say, although I'm not sure you could prove it, that some of Hooker's defense of ceremonial ultimately comes from a sort of Melanchthonian concept of adiaphora. Of course, Peter Barrow is very clear about his relationship with Nels Hemmingson, who was the Philippist professor of theology at Copenhagen, who gets dumped in 1577 after the Book of Concord is imposed. Funny fate to the Book of Concord in Denmark. The king threw it on the fire, saying, "We don't want any German arguments here," but promptly sacked the Philippist professor of theology. It's like, okay, try and make both sides happy on this one. But Hemmingson continues to be profoundly influential in things like ethics, natural law, and he's pushing Melanchthon's line of basic identity of divine law and natural law. And that seems to influence the non-Calvinists in England in the early 17th century.
Okay.
It's a messy picture.
And
the trouble is we try and make it clean and tidy.
Right.
And what we end up doing, if we take it too far, we end up with a caricature.
I have something that might help muddy the waters a bit further. So rolling back the clock to the earliest age of the English Reformation, what you were referring to as the preamble, what I would refer to as the Inception, the White Horse Inn, people like Robert Barnes. Yeah, you say in your article that the English Reformation was never in a narrow sense Lutheran, continuing to say that Melanchthon's influence in the reign of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were, important. But I would argue that at the inception, the English Reformation was decidedly Lutheran. And you can see that obviously in the clear, full-throated appeal to justification by grace through faith alone. And you can see that through the influence of Robert Barnes, who was a disciple not of Melanchthon, but of Luther.
Right.
And then you also get the strange case of John Frith, when Thomas Cranmer, I believe he was already archbishop at that point, but had not yet arrived at a perhaps Calvin era, like Butzer Calvin stage of Eucharistic theology.
Cage stage.
Was that?
I was gonna say cage stage. I'm kidding.
but Cranmer tried to get Frith to back down and arrive back again at a real presence, bodily presence, more Lutheran, if not fully transubstantiation position of the Eucharist. And Frith died. And then, of course, Cranmer, that was to his great detriment, because Cranmer eventually died for roughly the same reason. So I would say that at the outset, especially on justification by faith, and on the Eucharist, the English Reformation was decidedly Lutheran. And then because Henry VIII hated Luther, he was more interested in the mediating position of Melanchthon, and then Melanchthon and Butzer and Peter Martyr of Amigli sort of encouraged Cranmer, led Cranmer more towards that mediating position that would be Philippist and Butzerian, sort of between where we would say between Luther and
I see it a little bit differently to that. You can't really split Melanchthon and Luther in the 1520s until the very end.
Fair.
When Melanchthon becomes less assertive on predestination, Melanchthon's theology always remains very insistent on justification by grace through faith. What changes is his appreciation of the role of works in sanctification.
Yeah. Yep, definitely.
When Melanchthon begins to subtly differ from Luther at the beginning of the 1530s, that is the point at which the official Reformation in England is beginning. And the official Reformation tends to pull towards, if we have to deal with Wittenberg, we'll deal with Philip, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Because Luther's too volatile. As a result of that, the English church has a kind of a glide path where it can quite easily go reformed, as some of the Melanchthon influenced Lutheran churches in Germany eventually went reformed. What I see is England really is a forerunner of what happened in places like the Palatinate, Nassau, Hesse, Kassel, where initially they're Lutheran. In the controversies of the 1540s, 1550s, 1560s, 1570s, they're eventually forced to take their side. And because they don't want to accept the Flacian position, they tend to default towards the Reformed. Now, what's unusual in England is the liturgy remains unusually traditional. And I think at the end of the day, that is because the second prayer book of Edward VI is really rather canonized by the Marian martyrs. I think it's a case of, we want our Reformation back in 1559.
Right.
And that's very largely what Elizabeth I gives them.
Right. With the exception of the addition in the, for example, the addition in the words of institution or words of administration.
Well, that's because she's trying to conciliate the moderates.
Right.
And I think the moderates in this context are non-exiles like Matthew Parker. She's also got one eye on the political situation in the Holy Roman Empire. So it was in her interest to look a little Lutheran. And there's also, actually, in a funny sort of a way, that formula, the body of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was given for thee, preserve thy body and soul unto everlasting life. Take and eat this in remembrance that Christ died for thee, and feed on him in thy heart by faith with thanksgiving, is actually almost a perfect expression of the Butzer understanding and the Anglican understanding, as it's given in the articles, of what goes on in the Eucharist.
So we're kind of to you know, because we're coming up on time here, I kind of wanted to close off. You know, I thought about titling this episode something like Melanchthon, Father of Anglicanism, with a question mark on it, obviously, because that's something up for debate, obviously. But you know, at least in the classical 39 articles, as they speak on the Eucharist, I think is Article 27. I always forget the number of the Eucharist.
29.
Sorry,
I think it's 27, 28, isn't it?
Yeah, whichever number it is, and Bishop Peter's looking at it right now. Would you say that is the Melanchthonian / Butzerian?
It's actually quite funny because although the language is not Butzer or Melanchthon's, Article 28 is pretty much straight Melanchthon. In that it affirms that it's a means of grace. It affirms that it's a partaking of the body and blood of Christ. It denies transubstantiation. It affirms that the body of Christ is given, taken, and eaten in the supper only after a heavenly and spiritual manner. You know, that's all Melanchthon. 29, though, isn't Melanchthon. 29 smacks far more of Butzer and Calvin, because it denies that the wicked eat the body and blood of Christ, partake of the body and blood of Christ.
Okay.
So on the one side, you've got Article 28 is the middle position. You know, Melanchthon, Butzer, Vermigli, Calvin.
I remember the continuum you mentioned earlier, where you kind of plotted
all
that
could have signed off on 28.
Yeah.
And of course, 29 is suppressed for 8 years. Elizabeth's, the English translation of the Articles in 1563 does not contain Article 29. So she's careful not to declare herself. She's happy declaring herself in the middle. She does not want to declare herself as being definitely reformed by repudiating the concept of the wicked receiving the body and blood of Christ. Now, by 1571, when you have got Reformed churches within the empire, the Holy Roman Empire is less of a threat politically to England, and the French are tied up in the wars of religion. And also the Pope has excommunicated Elizabeth. Then she finally gives way on that point. But you know, 28 is pretty much everybody who's in the middle. Actually, in a funny sort of a way, I think even Luther could have signed off on 28 if you were nice enough to him.
Maybe the heavenly and spiritual language might have turned him off.
That
I don't know.
Might have been a hard sell.
Yeah.
Well, they arrive at the same conclusion though, because Luther, none of the reformers would have said that you receive any benefit from the Eucharist without faith.
Right.
So Luther would say faith is necessary for receiving the sacrament of the Eucharist anyway.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of spiritual or bodily presence. And that's the same concern with Article 29. Luther would have no problem with the outcome of Article 29, because he would just say Christ is objectively present, but if you have faith, he's objectively present as your Savior. If you don't have faith, he's objectively present
to your condemnation.
Right.
Yeah. And of course, you've got all the fancy footwork with the Wittenberg Concord that tries to bridge that gap, but doesn't quite finally make it. But the difficulty we often have with the 1550s and the 1560s is no matter how hard we try, we end up projecting back later orthodoxies into that funny middle period between 1540 and 1577.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, try not to.
Right. And that's something I've grown to appreciate, because you had the confessional Lutheranism begins with, the formula. Well, I mean, it begins on an official basis with the formula of Concord and onward. You get the further systematization of these more solidified strands that could not reconcile in Protestantism. Right. Something looking at the 16th century, I mean, I feel like there's a certain arrogance with some of people later looking back at people like Melanchthon and saying that, well, he had no backbone. He just tried to bend over for everyone. And that's kind of a narrative about him. And I feel that's not charitable fully. I mean, I can see maybe where they come from, but I don't find that fully charitable. And I, Christ's command for us to be one and for us to be in concord was something, I try to give the benefit of doubt to people like Melanchthon. They were genuinely trying to work toward that as Christians. And so, that's just kind of my own, note on Melanchthon and why I think I can appreciate him. It sounds like he, however you want to judge his legacy, he has lived on in beyond Lutheranism in our own tradition of Anglicanism. So
I found it interesting, Dewey Wallace's article, that right at the beginning he mentions that John Henry Newman, thought that, had sort of accepted instinctively that the English Reformation kind of followed Melanchthon.
Yeah. Just
And that
interesting.
is by 1825, 1830, that was kind of an understanding there was amongst Anglican high churchmen of the old
Yeah.
sort.
Yep. Yeah, that's something I could somewhat agree with Newman on. I mean, I think it wasn't I don't think Anglicanism was just a Melanchthonian, development outright, but yes, I think he had a definite influence on Anglicanism that we can definitely trace
Yeah,
and
see,
verify.
to grossly simplify, if you look at the Protestant high churchmen, there's a Melanchthonian streak to them.
Yeah.
If you look at the evangelicals, the old school evangelicals theologically tend to be 4-point Calvinists. In other words, they tend to agree with Zoricon doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually is a tension that is inherent to the English Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
You
And that
can't solve
tension,
it.
yeah, that tension is what I appreciate this episode and doing it because it brings it out. I mean, like I said, there's kind of the two narratives that it's either Reformation Anglicanism or the Anglo-Catholic revisionism, which I think we would all agree has, just little going for it. But there's a deeper story going on, and there's much more complex things going on, especially in the 16th century, that I think
very much
you
so.
shed a lot of light on today. So thank you. Any other further comments from either James or anyone, or but Bishop Peter, we appreciate having you on and coming on the show.
Glad you invited me.
Yeah. And I will put again for listeners in the show notes Bishop Peter's actual article on Melanchthon and Anglicanism that you can read for yourself, and which will also point you to several sources, some of which we mentioned, that also will give the very interesting point of connection that our tradition has with this German reformer Melanchthon. Melanchthon, which is, by the way, a Greek name. His original name meant, I think, it was black. It
Black
was
Earth.
That's it.
yeah,
Black Earth.
Black Earth, Schwartz. Yeah,
Yes.
and it was a humanist. It was a trend among humanists to well, actually, I think I read that his parents renamed him or something. His parents were under the
When he
humanist
was
influence
about
too, maybe.
11,
Sorry.
and I think it came from his great uncle Roy Klim.
Okay, who was a scholar as well, right?
Was a humanist, yeah.
Yeah. So just interesting part. So Melanchthon's it's not a very Germanic name, but this German reformer had, hopefully this episode brought to light why Anglicans can appreciate him. So but thank you all, and God bless. Thank you, Bishop Peter, for being on, James, and we will, for our listeners, we look forward to you tuning in again.